Have you ever believed your life was perfect? Steady job, kids asleep upstairs, a house that looks lived in but calm, only to realize in a single careless moment that everything you trusted might be an illusion? That smile across the table, the texts you never saw, the quiet routines you mistook for intimacy were all part of a story you weren't meant to witness? That the person you shared your bed with, laughed with at dinner, and trusted with your everyday fears could be living another life entirely, and you'd been blind until a glowing screen, a voice, or a message ripped the truth open before you, leaving you frozen in disbelief, knowing that nothing would ever feel safe again.
I used to believe stability was something you could measure by how quiet a house stayed at night, by how rarely voices were raised, by how efficiently two adults could move through life without interrupting each other's routines. And that belief held firm until one ordinary evening when I walked into a kitchen that felt wrong before I could explain why. The air heavier than it should have been, the lights too bright for how late it was, the clock ticking with an almost deliberate steadiness, and my wife's phone sitting face up on the counter where it never belonged, glowing softly like it had been left mid-conversation. 17 years of marriage trains you to rely on patterns instead of instincts, and our pattern had been perfect on paper. 3 kids asleep in their rooms, schedules aligned, bills paid, careers stable, no scandals, no public arguments, no visible fractures. So I had learned to define success by the absence of chaos, by how smoothly everything ran, by how easily we could tell friends we were doing great without stopping to question whether great meant anything beyond functional. And somewhere along the way, I let that quiet convince me that nothing important could be missing. We had become efficient partners in a shared system, exchanging information instead of emotions, coordinating logistics instead of checking in with each other, smiling at school events and family gatherings like people who knew how to perform unity, even if they no longer examined what held it together. And because nothing was obviously broken, I stopped asking myself uncomfortable questions, including when the last time was that we had really looked at each other without distraction. That's why the phone unsettled me, not because I suspected betrayal or deceit, but because it disrupted the rhythm I trusted, because it introduced movement into a life I believed had settled into permanence. And as I stared at it, I felt only a vague pressure in my chest, the kind you instinctively explain away because acknowledging it would require admitting that your version of reality might be incomplete. I told myself that long marriages naturally grow quieter, that adults don't need constant reassurance, that love matures into something calmer and less demanding, and those rationalizations came easily because they protected me from having to examine how transactional our connection had become, how often we spoke in updates instead of thoughts, how rarely we paused long enough to notice what the silence actually contained. I remember standing there longer than necessary, watching the screen dim and light up again, catching my reflection in the glass, and realizing how accustomed I had grown to moving through life on autopilot, mistaking predictability for safety and routine for intimacy, and thinking, with unsettling calm, that this must be what peace looks like when you stop interrogating it, a low hum you accept as normal until it suddenly disappears. The truth is, I didn't suspect anything at all, and that's what unsettles me most now, not the possibility of being lied to, but the realization that I had become someone who stopped paying close attention, someone who believed that as long as there was no explosion, there was no threat, someone who trusted surface stability more than emotional presence. And in that quiet kitchen, with nothing dramatic unfolding and no accusations forming in my mind, I was standing on the edge of a life that was already shifting without my permission, anchored there by one ordinary room, one careless detail, and a glowing screen that refused to go dark, waiting for me to either keep walking past it like I always had, or finally stop and see what it was about to change. I didn't expect anything that morning, not even a hint that my life was about to shift. But as I sat in traffic with headphones on, the podcast autoplayed a voice that should have been familiar yet sounded impossibly distant. My wife speaking casually about events and emotions that I had assumed were private, each word landing like a weight pressing against my chest, twisting my understanding of our 17 years together into something unrecognizable. And for a moment, I wondered if I had misheard, if my mind was tricking me, because how could the woman I shared a house, children, and routines with be describing our life as though I didn't exist, or worse, as though I were the villain in a story she was crafting for the world to hear without my knowledge? Every sentence jolted me further, each anecdote adding another brushstroke to a picture of our marriage I had never seen, exposing choices I hadn't known were hers alone, decisions I thought were mutual, and moments I had blindly trusted as shared memories, now cast in a different light. And I couldn't stop listening even as disbelief hardened into a physical tightness in my chest, my mind replaying each word, dissecting the tone, the pauses, the way she emphasized certain details, wondering which parts were exaggeration, which were truth, and which were carefully constructed to shape public perception, while I, the person who should have mattered most, had been kept in the dark. I remembered all the small signs I had dismissed over the years, late nights that weren't just work, the phone always face down, her laughter sometimes rehearsed, the way conversations felt transactional. And suddenly they connected into a clear pattern, one I hadn't wanted to see, that suggested my life had been running parallel to a reality I couldn't access. And knowing thousands of people were now hearing her story, judging me, believing her version, made me feel exposed in a way no private confrontation could have. The social pressure pressing on me even as my children slept peacefully above, oblivious to how fragile everything beneath them had quietly become. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself podcasts often dramatize, people embellish, perhaps there was nuance I hadn't yet grasped. Yet the certainty in her voice, the precision of her storytelling, the confidence behind her words all betrayed careful rehearsal rather than casual reflection, and the knot of fear, shame, and confusion in my chest only tightened, blending with a cold awareness that my life had already shifted without my knowledge, and that facing it would force me to see what had been happening all along. Traffic blurred past my car, the streetlights stretching like ghosts, and I realized that the world outside no longer mattered as much as the house waiting for me, a place that should have felt like sanctuary, now poised to feel alien. And in that instant, the choice was unavoidable. I could go home as if nothing had changed, pretending to ignore the voice that had pierced my ordinary morning, or I could confront the truth I had just discovered and risk everything unraveling in real time. And the more I thought about it, the heavier the decision became, until finally it was clear that her voice wasn't going to fade, that the story was already out, and that the next step I took would determine whether I remained blind or faced a life that had quietly slipped out of my hands, leaving me suspended in my car, heart pounding, headphones still on, caught between the impossibility of ignoring her words and the inevitability of seeing them for what they really were. Disbelief shifted quickly into a heavy, sinking weight as I realized that in her story, I wasn't just absent, I was the villain, a character meticulously constructed to justify outrage and elicit sympathy. And suddenly every memory I thought I owned felt tainted, replaying with new, hostile meaning. Conversations in the living room, laughter in the kitchen, quiet evenings on the couch, all of it shifted. The pauses, the glances, the silences that had once felt neutral, now charged, rehearsed, intentional. And it struck me that the life we had shared, the home we built together, the routines and compromises I had trusted were being reframed publicly without my knowledge, stripped of nuance, reduced to a narrative in which I was already judged and condemned. And as I sat there, each word she had spoken pressing against me, disbelief gave way to shame, not for things I had necessarily done, but for my own blindness, for letting comfort and routine replace attention, for mistaking a functioning household for intimacy, for trusting appearances over connection. Suddenly, all the small signs I had ignored, the late nights that weren't just work, the phone always face down, laughter that felt rehearsed, moments I had shrugged off became glaring red flags, clues to a story I had been living alongside but never allowed into. And I felt the weight of thousands of strangers hearing her version, nodding, forming opinions, judging before I could speak, a social pressure that pressed down on me even as my children slept quietly upstairs, unaware of how fragile everything beneath them had quietly become. Fear joined shame as I imagined friends, family, and colleagues who would hear this version first, the knowledge that perception now mattered more than truth sinking in with a physical tightness in my chest, the muffled creak of the stairs reminding me that life continued above me while mine was unraveling silently below. The realization hit that my own story had been stolen before I could defend it, and the quietness of the betrayal made it sharper, insidious, carefully rehearsed, almost invisible in its execution. And as I sat suspended between disbelief, rage, and panic, the stakes of every decision crystallized. Every choice I made next, whether to confront her, ignore it, or wait, would determine how much control I could reclaim over a narrative that had already begun reshaping my life. And I understood that no version of what I thought I knew about our shared life would ever feel the same again, that my own presence had been overwritten, and that in someone else's story I was already guilty, powerless, and forced to decide whether I would step forward into confrontation or retreat into a fragile illusion that would never feel safe, with the sound of my wife's voice still echoing in my mind, relentless, impossible to ignore, and shaping everything I had once believed to be unshakable. The moment I realized she had already cast me as the villain, my initial surge of anger and betrayal threatened to consume me, but I forced myself to pause, to step back and observe, treating the situation with a cold, strategic clarity I had never needed before in my personal life, analyzing every detail, every pattern, every habit that could provide insight into what she was planning, how she moved, and what I could anticipate next. It became painfully clear that the years of routine, of predictable schedules and repeated patterns now worked against me. She had the advantage of knowing my blind spots, my assumptions, and my complacency, and I had to compensate not with emotion, but with calculated awareness, turning my mind into a quiet observer instead of a reactor, noting the subtle changes in her tone during calls, the slight shifts in her schedule, the way she smiled in the kitchen while stirring her coffee as if nothing had shifted, all pieces of a puzzle I had been blind to, and for the first time I treated our life as a series of moves and countermoves, imagining every interaction, every encounter, every choice as a potential test, a trap, or an opportunity to regain control without exposing my awareness too soon. I reminded myself that emotion was the enemy in this scenario, that rage or accusation would only confirm the narrative she had constructed, and instead I focused on observation, careful note-taking, and imagining the scene from multiple perspectives, asking myself what she expected, how others might perceive the situation, and where my silence could give me leverage, all while maintaining the outward appearance of normalcy, laughing when necessary, speaking in measured tones, participating in routines as though nothing had shifted, but internally calculating, predicting, preparing, and weighing every small detail as if it were a chessboard, because the stakes had become more than personal. They were social, emotional, and psychological, and any misstep could accelerate the unraveling rather than slow it. And in this process, I discovered a side of myself I hadn't known existed, calm, detached, patient, ruthless in my own way, able to wait for the right moment to act rather than succumbing to the instinctive need to strike, to confront, to demand answers, because I understood that timing and positioning mattered more than immediate satisfaction,
noticing even the subtle gestures she made as she moved around the kitchen, the tilt of her head, the casual brush of her hand against the counter, all signaling a confidence I had to decode. And so I spent days observing patterns, cataloging inconsistencies, imagining scenarios, calculating risks and benefits, knowing that the payoff wouldn't come from shouting or confrontation, but from carefully orchestrated understanding, and that the moment I chose to act, everything would shift permanently. Yet until then, my power lay in restraint, in the discipline to feel the anger, acknowledge the betrayal, and convert it into deliberate preparation, transforming my panic and grief into a weapon no one could see, all while watching her rehearse smiles and gestures that hid the storm beneath, knowing that this silent vigilance would determine whether I regained any control over a story that was already unfolding without me.
For days, I watched her carefully curated facade in action, noticing the subtle ways she repeated the same lies, not out of carelessness, but with deliberate precision, and each repetition became a piece of evidence I could no longer ignore. I observed the patterns she had established, the phone always face down, messages disappearing before I could glance, the exact phrasing she used when describing events to friends, colleagues, and even casual acquaintances, and it struck me how rehearsed it all had become, like a performance where every gesture and word was timed to maintain her narrative. And as I sat in my office, pretending to scroll through emails, I felt a creeping, icy realization that these weren't isolated moments, but a consistent web of deception, each thread carefully woven, and my own life had been threading through it unnoticed. It wasn't just what she said, but how she moved, how she timed interactions, the way her laughter landed with a practiced cadence when discussing shared memories, as if she were the narrator and I were an extra. And the tension inside me built like a spring coiling tighter, each observation adding fuel to the silent storm. Because it wasn't enough that she had told one lie, it was that she had the audacity to repeat them confidently, publicly, and in a way that forced me to witness my own erasure in real time, the truth hiding behind her polished words and gestures. And every time she described our life differently to someone new, I felt a cold punch in my chest, a visceral proof that what I thought was reality was now negotiable, that my own experiences were being reframed without my consent. And the knowledge made me both furious and paralyzed, because confrontation risked exposing me too early, yet inaction risked letting her narrative solidify further, each retelling reinforcing her version and weakening mine. And I noticed the small details that confirmed it, the way her hands moved while she spoke, the subtle smirk when she glanced at mutual friends, the almost imperceptible shift in tone when a lie landed as intended, the calculated pauses that allowed listeners to fill in gaps in her favor, all of it meticulous. And every time I caught one of these moments, I felt a combination of disbelief, rage, and the gnawing knowledge that she had been running this silent campaign for months, maybe years, with me unknowingly in the wings. And as I pieced together each repeated lie, cataloged each deviation from the truth, and replayed the subtle cues over and over in my mind, I realized the strategy that had guided her actions wasn't random, it was intentional, methodical, and it forced me to operate under extreme psychological pressure, watching the life I thought I controlled dissolve incrementally into a story she could dictate to anyone, while I had to remain calm, patient, and silent, preparing for the moment when the evidence could be gathered and the truth confronted, yet knowing that until that moment came, I was trapped in a tense, ongoing theater of deception, a silent witness to a narrative that had already begun erasing me from its center. After days of watching patterns and repeated lies, I knew the next step was confirming where she had been meeting him, and the thought of physically tracing her movements made my chest tighten with a mix of fear, anger, and morbid curiosity. I started with small details. Restaurants she mentioned in passing, streets she claimed to walk down alone, parking lots she always seemed to pass through with calculated timing. And I noticed how often she repeated the same vague references, like a rehearsed script she assumed I would never check. And every detail became a breadcrumb, each one requiring careful observation, mental mapping, and timing that felt like a game of high-stakes chess where any misstep could blow the whole plan. I spent evenings driving the routes she had mentioned, sometimes circling the blocks, noting the way the light hit the street at certain hours, imagining her presence at each location, the way she might be laughing, leaning across a table, or glancing at her phone. And the more I observed, the more I realized she had choreographed everything to perfection, leaving no accidental clues, only patterns I could decode if I was patient and meticulous, which I now had to be because the stakes had become more than emotional. They were now tangible, physical, undeniable, and I couldn't let imagination be the only proof. Every sighting, every familiar exterior confirmed suspicions I had been avoiding. The small details she assumed were invisible to me, the way a server smiled at her, the angle of a chair at a table, the timing of lights flicking on or off, became evidence in my mind, hardening the reality of her betrayal. And each confirmation sent a shiver down my spine, because now it wasn't abstract, not a story I could dismiss or rationalize, but a real, visible presence that intersected with my own life. And the tension was unbearable, because I had to remain unseen while piecing together the puzzle, noting every minor clue, every repeated gesture, every small laugh or glance that betrayed her presence, cataloging it in my mind for later, while outwardly moving through my own life as though nothing had changed, laughing at dinner, engaging with my kids, pretending normalcy. Yet internally, every observation stacked into a pattern I couldn't ignore, each confirmation a psychological hammer tightening the cage around the truth. And as I retraced these locations again and again, imagining her interactions, the way she adjusted her hair or leaned closer across the table, the faint sound of cutlery or footsteps echoing in my memory, as though I could hear it all from a distance, I felt the crushing certainty that the life I thought I knew had concrete cracks, real-world manifestations I couldn't argue away. And the knowledge made me simultaneously terrified and determined, because once I had this evidence fully mapped, there would be no turning back, no way to dismiss the reality I had painstakingly confirmed, leaving me suspended on the edge of a confrontation I both feared and needed, knowing that the next steps would decide how much control, how much dignity, and how much truth I could reclaim from a story that had been quietly written without my consent.
Just when I thought I had absorbed every detail, traced every route, and cataloged every lie, an unexpected piece of information arrived that shifted the entire dynamic. A mutual acquaintance, someone I had trusted implicitly, casually mentioned seeing her at a place I had already confirmed in my own surveillance, and the moment they spoke, pausing briefly and glancing nervously at me as if unsure how much I already knew, a strange mixture of relief and dread washed over me, because suddenly I wasn't alone in recognizing the truth, and there was someone else who understood the reality without needing proof or explanation, someone who had noticed the inconsistencies, the patterns, and the subtle manipulations I had spent days obsessively tracking. Their hesitation, the way their voice faltered for a split second before confirming what I suspected, anchored the ally as a real person rather than a symbol, and the shift changed the stakes entirely, transforming my silent observation into collaborative awareness, amplifying both opportunity and danger, because the more people knew, the harder it would be to contain the fallout, and the weight of that knowledge pressed into my chest, a tangible tension that made my heartbeat spike and my stomach twist. I began thinking in terms of coordinated observation, subtle signals, ways to silently corroborate details without revealing awareness prematurely. And in that process, I noticed a shift in my own mindset. What had been panic, disbelief, and humiliation morphed into methodical patience, a quiet resolve that leveraged both my vigilance and the allies' perspective, giving me access to angles, details, and possibilities I couldn't have seen alone. Yet the tension remained,
visceral, like a low hum of danger under my skin, because every interaction she had, every smile, every gesture, every casual comment could now be interpreted in light of this new confirmation, forcing me to anticipate her moves with a clarity I hadn't possessed alone. And as I cataloged each subtle cue, the tilt of her head, the brief flicker of a smirk, the timing of a laugh, I felt the full weight of what silence, observation, and patient strategy could accomplish, knowing that the moment we acted would require precision, restraint, and timing, because revealing awareness too soon would unravel everything. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a controlled anticipation, a strategic advantage I hadn't had before. Yet that same advantage made the stakes sharper, every heartbeat a reminder that exposure, misstep, or error could undo weeks of careful calculation. And while I now had an ally, a silent witness to confirm the patterns I had already uncovered, the responsibility to act wisely, to remain patient, and to channel my fear and anger into preparation pressed down on me like a weight I could not ignore, keeping me tense, alert, and ready for the next move that could finally shift the story in my favor. The moment the ally and I silently acknowledged what we both had witnessed, a strange and heavy sense of alignment settled over us, a quiet understanding that this wasn't just my story, her deception, or my imagination, but a shared reality that demanded precision. And as we pieced together the timeline in hushed tones, comparing what we had observed, every small confirmation, the same lie repeated at the same table, the same gestures performed with rehearsed casualness, the subtle cues she hadn't noticed we were noticing, formed a lattice of undeniable truth. And the gravity of it pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't shake, a mixture of fear, validation, and the thrill of finally knowing I wasn't alone. But the thrill was tempered by the acute awareness of risk, because alignment also meant that the stakes were exponentially higher, the web of deception more dangerous if discovered, and every look, every smirk, every carefully timed laugh she delivered now carried the possibility of exposure or escalation. We shared notes in a silent rhythm, gestures instead of words, glances that communicated hours of observation in a second, the tension in the room coiling tighter as I realized how methodical she had been, how calculated every step of her behavior. And yet, even in her meticulousness, she had unknowingly created openings that two focused observers could detect. And the combination of our awareness turned what had once been confusion and doubt into clarity, strategic advantage, and controlled anticipation, like watching a game of chess unfold where I could see both sides, anticipate moves, and prepare countermoves. And in that moment, I felt the psychological pressure tighten in my chest, a tangible knot of adrenaline and fear that kept my mind razor sharp, cataloging gestures, timing, and patterns, while also forcing me to balance restraint with readiness, because any premature action could unravel everything. And I understood that the next steps, if mishandled, would make the entire investigation collapse, leaving me vulnerable emotionally, socially, and psychologically. The allies' nervous but steady presence reinforced the reality that this was no longer solitary vigilance, that validation could be found without immediate confrontation, and yet the alignment also amplified the urgency, because knowing that someone else shared the truth meant that we now had both the opportunity and responsibility to act with precision. And as I watched her interact with the world, laughing, moving, and performing as if nothing had shifted, the tension coiled tighter, every heartbeat reminding me that this alignment was both a gift and a trap, a chance to reclaim control silently, but also a warning that the moment we moved would need perfect timing, careful observation, and unyielding discipline. And until that moment came, I had to sit with the pressure, the fear, and the anticipation of two people quietly holding a secret that could upend everything at any instant. After days of observing, confirming, and aligning with my ally, the moment came to transform silent vigilance into strategy, and I realized that any action now would need to be orchestrated with near military precision, because one misstep could unravel everything and expose both our knowledge and vulnerability. So I began mapping the sequence of her movements, the locations she frequented, The timing of her interactions, her gestures, the subtle pauses in her speech, and the habits she repeated without noticing. And I imagined scenarios, contingencies, and reactions, running them like simulations in my mind to prepare for every possible outcome. I noted what could go wrong at each step, how she might react if confronted too soon, how others might misinterpret our moves, and how I could assert presence without tipping my hand. And in doing so, I became hyper-aware of the environment, the tilt of her coffee cup, the echo of footsteps in hallways, the flicker of lights on street corners, all cues that could guide decisions and reveal opportunities without direct confrontation. And the mental load was enormous, my chest tight with anticipation and adrenaline, every calculation pressing on me like weight rather than a strategic advantage, forcing me to balance observation, simulation, and evaluation with the constant reminder that the stakes were now deeply personal, emotional, and psychological. I spent hours rehearsing conversations, imagining how words, gestures, and timing might unfold, considering how to maintain composure while revealing just enough knowledge to assert presence without overplaying, how to leverage patterns I had cataloged against her without allowing emotion to dictate pace. And the act of planning became almost obsessive, a continuous loop of analysis, rehearsal, and mental projection that both exhausted and sharpened me. Because control was no longer passive, it was active, demanding absolute discipline, patience, and awareness. And the physical sensations in my body mirrored the weight of responsibility. The tight chest, rapid heartbeat, and tense shoulders reminding me constantly of what was at risk. Finally, the plan crystallized in my mind, not as a single confrontational act, but as a series of deliberate, measured moves designed to reclaim agency, validate truth, and assert presence without surrendering dignity. And as I paused to take stock, the tension remained, high and unrelenting, because I knew that even perfect preparation could not eliminate risk, and the next step would require patience, precision, and unyielding discipline. A moment where strategy and opportunity would intersect, defining not only how the story unfolded, but whether I retained control, clarity, and composure in a situation deliberately crafted to strip them away, leaving me suspended between anticipation and action, burdened by the knowledge of what must be done, yet ready to strike with calculated restraint when the time arrived. The days that followed felt stretched into an eternity, each one a careful balancing act between normalcy and silent panic, because while my outward life continued, laughter with the kids, work emails, casual dinners, mundane errands, the tension coiled tighter with every small observation, every gesture she made that I now cataloged in real time. I could neither confront it nor ignore it without consequences. The pressure built not only from her deception, but also from the environment itself, the quiet hum of the house, the ticking of clocks, the way the kids' laughter could suddenly cut through the tension, and the psychological weight of knowing her deceit while maintaining composure was crushing, like carrying a hidden storm in my chest while smiling through the sunshine. I noticed everything she did, from the casual tilt of her head as she scrolled through her phone to the glances she threw toward the living room when I was nearby, each movement a reminder that the truth was dancing just beyond the surface. And I replayed her movements and interactions obsessively in my mind, noting inconsistencies, rehearsed gestures, and timing, imagining what each action might conceal and how it connected to the larger pattern I had uncovered. The allies' occasional confirmations through subtle signals reinforced the reality that I wasn't alone in my awareness, yet even that knowledge carried tension, because knowing someone else shared the truth made the stakes sharper, the responsibility heavier, and the burden of patience more acute. I found myself waking at night with a tightness in my chest, heart racing, mind spinning through possible scenarios, wondering if today would be the day she slipped, the day the plan I had rehearsed for weeks could finally move forward, or if another day of careful observation and emotional restraint would be required. As I navigated mundane routines, packing lunches, responding to texts, commuting to work, the shadow of anticipation clung to me, turning ordinary moments into trials of endurance, and every laugh, glance, or casual remark she made felt charged with unspoken consequences, forcing me to balance presence with observation, connection with restraint, and composure with preparedness. By the end of the week, I felt simultaneously exhausted, sharpened, and hyper-alert, acutely aware that the crescendo of this tension was approaching, that all the cataloged evidence, silent observations, and mental preparation were converging toward a single pivotal moment where patience, precision, and discipline would collide. And I understood that surviving this week intact was not merely about observation or planning. It was about holding every nerve, every suppressed emotion, and every thought in perfect alignment until the moment of confrontation arrived, and knowing that this delicate balance, maintained under constant pressure, would determine not only how the story unfolded, but whether I retained control, clarity, and composure in a situation deliberately constructed to strip them away.
The day I decided it was time to edge closer to action, every ordinary preparation became a study in controlled intensity. Because the stakes were no longer abstract, they were immediate, pressing, and unavoidable, and even the smallest choices carried hidden weight. I considered what to wear, not for style, but for the psychological message it would send, the subtle cues she might unconsciously pick up, and each decision required mental rehearsal, imagining her reactions, the tilt of her head, the pause in her breath, the micro-expression that might betray recognition, all while externally maintaining calm composure, blending seamlessly into the day as if nothing had changed, while inside, tension coiled, alertness sharpened, and adrenaline hummed in my veins, each heartbeat counting down to an invisible moment when silent observation would meet deliberate action. I rehearsed words, gestures, and timing, weighing each phrase against potential misinterpretation, each movement against possible misreading, knowing that even a fraction of error could unravel weeks of careful planning. I studied the environment, the lighting, angles, possible witnesses, even background noises, and adjusted my mental map of every variable that might influence perception, control, and outcome, while the Allies' subtle confirmations reminded me that this was not a solo effort, that patience and restraint were as potent as confrontation itself. I oscillated between stillness and hypervigilance, between outward calm and internal storm. I rehearsed countless permutations of action and reaction, noticing gestures, micro-expressions, and environmental cues, each one adding to the mental load, each one reinforcing that precision mattered more than impulse. My body mirrored the tension, tight shoulders, quickened heartbeat, a low hum of alertness under every movement, yet I forced the exterior to remain neutral, ordinary, undetectable, because the balance of visible calm and internal storm was itself a weapon. Every rehearsal, every imagined interaction, every careful calibration of expression and tone tightened my focus and reinforced discipline, shaping me into a person capable of confronting chaos with composure. By the day's end, I understood that preparation itself carried weight and suspense, that every thought, every suppressed emotion, every controlled movement would be tested at the precise moment of impact, and that success required not just observation, not just planning, but the ability to remain unshakable, precise, and fully composed when strategy and opportunity collided, because in that instant, the stakes would crystallize, and the way I had carried the tension, refined every cue, and held every nerve would define not only the confrontation itself, but whether I retained control, clarity, and authority in a situation engineered to unsettle, expose, and test me in every conceivable way. The moment came faster than I anticipated, a sudden collision of attention, where a glance across the room held more weight than any words could, and as our eyes met, the world seemed to contract into a single, suspended second, charged with recognition, tension, and unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had been building beneath the surface. I felt my chest tighten, a sharp pressure that mirrored the rapid beat of my heart, and in that instant,
All preparation, observation, and rehearsal crystallized into raw awareness. Every micro-expression she displayed, the slight widening of her eyes, the subtle shift in her posture, the almost imperceptible pause in her breathing, speaking volumes that words could never convey. And yet the room remained ordinary, filled with the hum of background noise, the muted clatter of dishes, the distant laughter of children, all contrasting with the volcanic intensity contained in that single exchange. A tension so thick it was almost tangible, pressing against my skin and amplifying every sensory detail. The light flickering across her face, the faint scent of her perfume, the controlled cadence of her movements, all of it communicating danger, awareness, and fragile opportunity simultaneously. In that briefest moment, I realized how much power existed in restraint, in the silent acknowledgement of truth, in the unspoken calculus of patience versus impulse. And I could feel the mental coil tighten further, the adrenaline sharpening my senses as I cataloged every nuance, every potential response, every conceivable outcome, because one misread glance, one twitch of muscle, one subtle lapse in control could unravel weeks of careful preparation. And yet, even in the intensity, there was a strange electric clarity, a moment of psychological alignment where I understood exactly how she perceived me, how I perceived her, and how the silent truth between us now dictated every choice, every possible move. I noted the slight hesitation in her eyes, the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers lingered on the edge of a table, and I realized that recognition was a weapon as precise as observation, capable of cutting through deception without a single word, and that holding that eye contact without flinching, without revealing relief or anger, without overplaying comprehension, was itself an act of control, a demonstration of composure that communicated far more than confrontation ever could. And in the span of that suspended second, I felt the accumulated weight of every preceding day, every observation, every plan, every silent rehearsal coalesce into a single point of heightened awareness, a pivot where the emotional stakes, the psychological stakes, and the physical presence converged, leaving us both momentarily suspended in the gravity of truth, knowing that from this point forward, nothing could remain hidden, nothing could remain ordinary, and the coming moments would define the trajectory of everything we had silently endured, prepared, and anticipated. As the moment of confrontation arrived, I laid out the evidence in a measured, deliberate way, knowing that precision mattered more than volume, and that the impact would come not from overwhelming detail, but from the calculated weight of select, undeniable proof. I placed only the most revealing messages, the ones that illustrated pattern without needing explanation, letting the content speak for itself. And as I observed her reaction, the subtle shifts in her posture, the tremor in her fingers, the brief flicker of recognition in her eyes, I felt a surge of controlled anticipation, the tension compressing around us like a physical presence, pressing in as if the room itself was aware of the stakes. Each piece of evidence landed silently but with psychological force, creating a rhythm of awareness and validation. And I could see the mental calculations racing behind her eyes, the realization dawning that what had been invisible to others was now visible, undeniable, and uncompromising. And the air between us vibrated with the weight of truth made concrete, of privacy breached by meticulous observation. And while my composure remained outwardly neutral, inside I was acutely aware of every heartbeat, every subtle inhale, every micro-motion that reflected the shock, the fear, and the awareness of consequences settling in. The children's laughter in the distance, the hum of daily life outside the immediate moment, only heightened the contrast, emphasizing the intensity of what was occurring in our small sphere of suspended reality. And I noted the smallest gestures, the slight recoil of her body, the tightening of her jaw, the flash of hesitation before her eyes met mine again. each one a confirmation of the potency of restraint, of measured action, and of the invisible power that preparation and patience had afforded me, because by carefully selecting what to reveal and when, I retained control of the narrative, of the psychological environment, and of my own emotional composure, allowing the evidence to do the work without any need for dramatics or escalation beyond what the situation itself demanded. I felt the delicate balance of tension and release, the quiet thrill of seeing patterns recognized, of silent acknowledgement met with unavoidable realization, and as the final pieces were observed, the room seemed to exhale collectively. Yet the weight remained, because while the evidence confirmed truth, it did not solve the emotional reckoning, did not soften the impact of betrayal, and did not conclude the internal conflicts that had been simmering for weeks, leaving a charged, electric moment suspended between revelation and consequence, between acknowledgement and reaction, where every microsecond carried the gravity of all that had been prepared, all that had been endured, and all that was about to unfold in the intimate, unspoken space between us. As I held her phone, scrolling through the messages I had once feared to see, the weight of every word hit with a precision that no evidence, no image, and no outward gesture could match, because these were words meant to be private, intimate, hidden. And yet they now spoke louder than any confrontation could, revealing not just betrayal, but intention, desire, and patterns that had existed long before the signs I had been trained to recognize. Each message unfolded like a scalpel, cutting through any remaining illusions, stripping away the veneers of routine, calm, and the carefully curated image of normalcy. And I could feel the tension in my body mirror the sharpness of the revelations, the tightness in my chest, the hollow ache behind my eyes, the sudden awareness of time slowing as I processed each syllable and punctuation, each casual phrase layered with consequence, each flippant expression weighted by hidden significance. And I realized that the emotional devastation was not merely about infidelity itself, but about the intimacy of secrecy, the deliberate concealment, and the quiet betrayal that had been living alongside me, unseen until now. I noticed how she had constructed her narrative, the repetition of lies, the soft manipulation woven into mundane conversations, the small confirmations of attention elsewhere, and the careful calibration of words to avoid detection. And each element compounded the realization that this was not accidental, not impulsive, not trivial, but an ongoing orchestration that had been hidden behind the life we had appeared to share. And while outwardly I maintained composure, inwardly I experienced a cascade of disbelief, anger, sorrow, and a surreal sense of detachment, like watching the collapse of a familiar world in slow motion. And even as I absorbed the depth of her duplicity, I also recognized a strange clarity, a confirmation of all the suspicions, preparations, and rehearsals that had brought me to this precise point, because every word, every line of text, every private admission now intersected with the evidence I had already collected. And the room itself seemed to hold its breath, charged with the gravity of revelation, the electricity of unspoken truths, and the inevitability of consequences, leaving me suspended in a moment where the private world she had constructed collided with the unyielding reality of exposure, where emotional devastation met strategic comprehension, where heartbreak and clarity existed side by side. And I understood, with a painful yet undeniable precision, that this was the emotional apex, the point where restraint, preparation, and silent endurance converged to create a moment that would define not only the confrontation, but every decision, every feeling, and every choice that would follow in the aftermath of betrayal.
Returning home after the confrontation, the weight of what had been revealed settled over every corner of the house, an invisible fog that touched every familiar object, every room, every sound,
and even the light that streamed through the windows felt different, sharper, exposing the ordinary life we had taken for granted and reframing it with a tension that was impossible to ignore. The children's laughter, once a source of comfort, now carried a bittersweet resonance, reminding me that while they were oblivious to the specifics, they sensed the subtle shift in my energy, the tightness in my shoulders, the controlled cadence of my voice, the way I moved through the rooms with careful deliberation. And I realized that the fallout was not only about her betrayal, but about the delicate balance of maintaining stability, protecting innocence, and navigating the emotional fallout in real time. Because every glance I exchanged with my daughter, every casual interaction in the kitchen or hallway, now carried the unspoken weight of truth. And I could see her questions lingering behind bright, innocent eyes, sensing that something fundamental had changed, but not yet knowing exactly what, which forced me to hold myself in a state of constant composure, patience, and empathy, while internally wrestling with anger, sorrow, and the echoing sting of betrayal. I observed my wife in her own careful movements, noticing the tension in her jaw, the fleeting hesitations, the subtle attempts at normalcy, and it became clear that the private world we had shared was fractured irreparably, that routines, gestures, and conversations would never again exist in the same neutral space. And yet, I also understood that this was a moment of reckoning, a rare opportunity to define how the aftermath unfolded through restraint, clarity, and deliberate emotional pacing, because acting impulsively, showing rage or collapse, would not only escalate tension, but also rob me of control over the environment, over the narrative, and over the subtle cues that dictated how my children would perceive stability and trust. And so I maintained calm externally, even as internally every nerve was alert, every memory of past deception replaying with precision. And in the quiet moments, packing lunches, moving through rooms, sharing small smiles or brief exchanges, I measured every word, every pause, every action, aware that the aftermath was not just immediate emotional fallout, but the shaping of ongoing dynamics, the preservation of dignity, and the careful navigation of fractured relationships. Knowing that this period would define how trust, recognition, and restraint would carry forward, setting the stage for consequences, healing, and the eventual rebuilding of a life forever changed by what had been quietly exposed and then undeniably confirmed.
The days that followed carried a weight that extended beyond the walls of our home, as the ripple effects of exposure and confrontation reached into work, social circles, and the quieter corners of daily life. But I navigated them with the same precision and restraint that had guided the confrontation itself, knowing that over-explaining, overreacting, or indulging in vindictive behavior would only undermine the control I had painstakingly maintained. And so I focused on measured steps, keeping communication clear but minimal, preserving routines for the children, and managing external interactions with a calm neutrality that belied the internal turbulence, while privately cataloging lessons learned, subtle shifts in relationships, and the social recalibrations that unfolded as the truth became increasingly visible to those who had previously seen only a curated version of our lives. Professional dynamics shifted quietly but noticeably. Colleagues glanced differently, conversations carried an unspoken awareness, and while I refused to leverage the situation for personal gain, I understood that perception had already shifted irrevocably, that credibility, trust, and alignment now existed on a recalibrated plane, and every interaction required careful observation, subtle navigation, and the constant weighing of impulse against consequence, because misjudgment could escalate what was already delicate, and the invisible consequences, the altered friendships, cautious alliances, and minor social slights pressed just as heavily as any overt challenge, reminding me that control was not about retaliation, but about composure, measured response, and psychological endurance.
Simultaneously, financial and logistical realities demanded attention. Shared responsibilities, previously unquestioned routines, and minor obligations now required precise coordination, negotiation, and careful management to prevent unnecessary friction. Yet even in this realm, I maintained internal discipline, focusing on solutions rather than recrimination, on clarity rather than punishment, because the emotional apex had already passed, and the goal was not to win, but to navigate consequences with dignity, presence, and awareness. At night, in the quiet of the house, I reflected on how the interplay of restraint, strategy, and emotional intelligence had shaped the fallout, recognizing that the tangible consequences were only half of the story, that the internal transformation, patience, self-control, and the ability to confront chaos without losing composure was the real measure of endurance. And while external circumstances continued to shift, social dynamics evolved, and obligations demanded attention, I remained anchored, aware that the careful compression of consequences, avoidance of melodrama, and steady management of perception were the only ways to preserve stability, guide recovery, and lay the groundwork for rebuilding a life that, though forever changed, could still be navigated with dignity, integrity, and unwavering composure, proving that control is not about revenge, but about mastery over circumstance and self. After the storm of confrontation, revelation, and consequence, life settled into a new rhythm, one defined not by illusion or pretense, but by careful reconstruction, deliberate awareness, and a sharper understanding of trust, boundaries, and personal responsibility. Mornings began with a quiet deliberation, observing the small victories of composure, the way I could move through the house without the heavy tension of anticipation, the way I interacted with my children with presence rather than distraction, and the way ordinary routines regained their shape while still carrying the invisible imprint of what had been endured, because every glance, every conversation, and every action was now filtered through a lens of heightened awareness and emotional intelligence. And I realized that rebuilding was less about restoring what was lost and more about constructing a life that could endure the realities of betrayal, maintain dignity, and honor both my own values and the fragile stability of those around me. I set new boundaries with precision, cultivated calmness in spaces that had once been fraught with hidden tension, and nurtured relationships with an understanding that trust, once fractured, requires patience, clarity, and consistent demonstration of integrity. And while the scars of exposure remained, silent reminders of what had been revealed and what had been silently endured, they served as guides rather than weights, markers of resilience and proof that measured observation, restraint, and emotional discipline could survive even the most destabilizing of circumstances. Evenings became a space for reflection rather than rumination, where the quiet hum of daily life was no longer overshadowed by the dread of discovery, and I found myself appreciating the subtle victories, the small gestures of authenticity from my children, the regained composure in interactions, the clarity of thought that came from knowing exactly what to observe and when to intervene, and the deep understanding that control is not about punishment or dominance, but about sustaining calm, presence, and strategic foresight in the face of chaos. Yet even as I adjusted, rebuilt, and moved forward, the mind remained alert, the questions lingered, and the curiosity persisted, because every resolution contains seeds of the next story. Every lesson learned carries the potential for a deeper challenge, and as I reflected on what had transpired, I realized that while this chapter was ending, the next confrontation, the next discovery, and the next test of trust were never far away, leaving a quiet but undeniable anticipation that life, with its hidden truths and unexpected revelations, always has more to teach those who are willing to observe, endure, and navigate it with clarity and composure. And so the story closes here for now, but the mind remains vigilant. The heart remains cautious, and the viewer is left with one unspoken question. When exposure meets hidden truth again, will restraint, patience, and awareness be enough, or will the next story reveal entirely new depths of deception?